In this episode of Derp, I fixed the space worm to work in Godot 4. Just wanted to say a quick thank you for helping me get to 1,000 subscribers. I probably wouldn't even be making a game if it wasn't for this channel, so I really appreciate your support. First, I'll make a new folder for the generic worm in the boss folder. Then I'll make a new inherited scene from the boss encounter. Save that as the worm boss encounter. I'll change the text to base worm and make the splash gradient unique, but I'll leave that the same. Then I'll make a variant folder in the wyrm folder and make a new inherited scene from the worm encounter. Save this as the space worm. Then I'll change the splash text and make the gradient unique again. Then I'll change the gradient to pink at the beginning, then purple and blue, then teal at the end, or light blue, like so. Then I'll open up the derp space dimension and change the boss list from the black hole to the space worm. Then in the boss scene, I'll set the timer to 1 second. So now you can see the color replace and the boss name are displaying when it should spawn. So now I'll copy the wyrmhole folder from the space worm and move it into the wyrm folder. Here I have the boss wyrmhole and the player portal. The wyrmhole has 2 animation players, one to make it spin, which I have autoplay on load enabled, and the resize player, which can close and open the portal. And I have open set to auto load as well, so it will open and spin at the same time. Then the resize player animation finish signal is connected to the script. If the animation name is open, emit the opened signal, and if the name is closed, it emits the closed signal. So in the base worm encounter, I'll add the wyrmhole scene. So now it spawns a portal which spins, and it stopped spinning, so I need to enable looping on the spin player. So now it should keep spinning after it is opened. like so. Now in the boss worm encounter, I'll attach a new script extending boss encounter, then connect to the wyrmhole opened signal. Here I'll call the spawn worm function and tell the wyrmhole to close. And spawn worm, I'll just print boss worm spawned for now, just to see if that's working. So as you can see, the portal is not closing and the boss did not spawn. That's because the wyrmhole is passing a parameter with the opened signal. And I'm actually going to handle this differently, so I'll just get rid of the parameter altogether. And now if I don't get knocked away from the portal, you can see that it closed and the boss worm has spawned. So now in the boss worm encounter, I will make a new variable for the player portal equals preload the player portal scene. Then in spawn worm, I'll just call the encounter defeated signal for now, or function. Here I will emit the boss defeated signal, then call the spawn player portal, and for this, I'll open up the original space worm script and copy the spawn player portal from here. So this makes two portal instances and links them and sets the global position. For the first portal, the dimension ID is 0, and for the second, it's randomly chosen between 1 and 2. Then it spawns the portals to the appropriate dimension. So now when the boss portal is opened, it spawns a player portal, which takes you to a different dimension, and because the portal is emitting the boss defeated signal, it spawns a new boss on the timer. So this is the Olympus dimension, and I'll make sure the Oceanus dimension is working as well. I did make the hitbox a little bit smaller on the portals, so they're harder to hit. So both dimensions are working, and the portals will return you between the dimensions. Now I can make a new inherited scene from the boss worm encounter. Change the splash text to aqua worm, and I'll make the gradient unique. Set the colors from dark green to lime green to cayenne, and dark blue. And I'll shift the green back a little bit. I think that'll look good. So I'll save this as the aqua wyrm. And then I'll add it to the Oceanus dimension boss spawner. Increase the size to 1 and then drag the scene into the array like so. Next, I'll make a new inherited scene for the thunder wyrm. Make the gradient unique, and I'll make it go from yellow to gold. To dark gray, and you can turn the saturation all the way down to make it grayscale. And I'll add a silver lining at the end. Like so. So it looks like a thunder cloud with lightning. So I'll save this and add it to the Olympus dimension boss list. So I'll increase the size and drag the scene into the list. Now to make the player portal work in all the dimensions, first I need to add the current dimension variable to the connector auto load script, so it's called from anywhere in the tree. I'll set it to 0 by default, which is the derp space dimension. Then in the load dimension function, I get the current dimension node and remove it from the main tree, then add the new dimension from the dimension list. So even when you remove the dimension from the tree, it persists in this array, so you can reload it with all of the enemies still there. Here in load dimension, at the end, I'll set the current dimension equal to the new ID to keep track. Then in the boss encounter for the space wyrm, I will set the portal 1 dimension ID equal to the connector dot current dimension, and the portal 2 dimension ID will be rand integer in the range of 0 to connector dot dimension list dot size -1, because this is inclusive. Now I don't want the portal 2 to be in the same dimension as the portal 1, so they'll be stacked. I want it to take you to a different dimension. So I'll say while the portal 2 dimension ID equals the connector dot current dimension, then get a random dimension. Then I'll set the portal dimension 2 ID to the current dimension here so that it automatically starts the loop and I don't have to duplicate this code. And this was getting stuck in the loop because I forgot to assign the dimension ID. So now it will spawn new bosses in the different dimensions. This takes me to the Oceanus, and it's spawning the aqua worms. And if I can get back to one of the portals. So now I'm back in the Derp space dimension. And now the thunder worms are spawning in the Olympus dimension as well. So that all seems to be working. So now I'll move the rest of the files from the space worm into the generic worm. And I'll rename space worm GD and space worm.tscn. So now in the worm encounter, I'll add another variable for the worm scene and preload the worm scene there. So I have the intro.gd, and basically I want to instantiate the worm and build it with 3 segments and close the wormhole. So I can go ahead and delete the intro scene, and in the boss encounter in spawn worm, I'll say worm equals worm scene dot instantiate, then worm dot build with 3, and add child worm to add it to the encounter scene. And in the worm scene, I need to change all of the references to the new file path. So I'll just change all of the space worm strings to worm. And I'll comment out the player portal for now. This will just emit a signal. And we'll change this from space worm to worm. So now I'll run the project, and it throws an error because it can't load the worm segment class. So I'll change this to export var health and set the type to capped value and run it again. So now it's throwing an error in the beam activate because the height is null. So if I go to this is the laser beam class, so the length and height are onReady variables, but I'm calling the activate before it's ready, so those values are not set yet, essentially. So instead of calling the laser function in the build function, of the worm boss, I will call laser in the ready function instead. So I'll run it again and see what error it throws. So this is the particle laser beam, which extends the base laser beam. And I'll open up the particle beam. So it's trying to set the particle's line2D dot points equal to the line2D dot points, but I have changed the path of the line2D to reset X form, and the particle line will have the global coordinates as well, so I'll move that up. This just resets the position and rotation from the parent, so I can use global coordinates there. So I'll change the path to reset X form slash line2D. And run it again. And I also need to comment out the encounter defeated from the spawn worm function so it doesn't constantly spawn the worms. So now it does not throw an error when the boss spawns, but as you can see, the segments are not taking damage from the player beam. That's because the worm is currently on the player collision layer. So I'll set the layer to enemy, which is layer 2, and I'll set the mask to players and enemies so it can still collide. And now the segments will take damage from the beam, but the split function doesn't seem to be working. So in the worm class, when a segment is destroyed, I copy the top half segments into a new worm and emit the spawn boss signal with the new worm as the parameter. So in the boss encounter, I'll make a new function to make the initial worm, and I'll copy the instantiate and build to there, then call the spawn worm function with the new worm, and when the wormhole opens, I'll call init worm instead. So in spawn worm, now I'll connect to the worm spawn boss signal to the spawn worm function. And now when you destroy a segment, a new worm is spawned. Like so. So now the space worm laser beam is pointing away from the player instead of towards you. So I need to open up the space worm head shape scene, and the angle to point function has been flipped, so I need to just reverse the parameters. So now it's from the bone position to the derp star. And also the collision shape is half of the size because the extent size was changed, so I'll double those, and now it's the correct size. And I'll go ahead and do that for the body and tail as well. And now I'll open up the head bone, and since we moved the laser line, the values were reset. So I'll make this 40 pixels wide and 700 long. Then I'll set the fill texture to a gradient 2D and drag that from the top to the bottom corner. Set the texture mode to tile or stretch. And I'll set up the gradient. From light pink and dark in the middle. And actually, I think I want it to be light in the middle, so I'll just flip those around. And I'll be changing this later anyway. Then set the default color, turn the alpha down to about there. And now you can see that the laser beam follows the player, like so. I'll go ahead and increase the opacity a little bit more. So now to make the lightning particles show up, I have the particles line, which has the fill texture set to the particles viewport. So I'll increase the width and length. This is done automatically through the code, but it will make it easier to see in the editor. So now the particle emitter has been reset when I converted to Godot 4. So I'll set the scale from 0.2 to 0.3 and the initial velocity to 100. So now you can see they start moving along the beam, and I'll set the angle to between -50 and 50. So they're still all straight up and down. That's because you need to disable the Z axis. And now they have random rotations. That might be a little bit too much. I'll do like 30 to 30. And now it's getting cut off, so I need to increase the lifetime and the pre-process so that it will render. And now it's going all the way to the end. Actually, I want the lightning to move a bit faster. So I'll turn up the velocity to 150, and now they're spaced further apart, so I can turn the lifetime back down a bit, or I could increase the amount if it was getting cut off already. And I want to lower the alpha a little bit, so it's not so dark. Now I'll copy this node and duplicate it. Actually, set the amount to 26 on this one so it's staggered. Then I will make the particle process material unique, and so it doesn't overwrite the initial one. Then I'll set the angle between 150 and 210, so they're upside down. And now you can see the lightning particles are on the laser beam when the worm is targeting. Now to fix the wormhole spawning, I'll open up the worm scene. I need to fix the collision shape size, and in the script I'll add the wormhole spawned signal, and I'll emit this in the spawn wormhole. This creates two portals, one at the worm's position and one at the player. Then when the portal is opened, it calls the teleport function. Since the open signal no longer passes the portal as a parameter, I will bind it to the teleport function instead. So it gets the position and emits the close wormhole, which closes both. So now in the boss encounter, I'll add a function to spawn the wormhole, which adds it as a child to the scene. And in spawn worm, I'll connect to the wormhole spawned signal to the spawn wormhole function. And finally, I want to set the z-index of the wormhole to -1 so that it renders behind the bumper and players. So now, after the worm charges, it will make a portal and teleport to the player. As you can see. Now currently the worm flies away from the player when it charges instead of towards, which is obviously not what I want. So in the worm class, in the charge function, I thought I would need to reverse the call on the angle to point, but I think I have something inverted in the worm build script, so it does point in the correct direction, but then it still flies backwards. So I'll set the linear velocity to -500 rotated by the rotation, and now it should fly towards the player. And next I want to fix the purple circle aura when it charges. So I'll open up the worm body shape, and in the charge particles I'll set the initial velocity to -130 for both the min and the max, so they're the same speed. And I want to increase the amount to 3 so it's more dense, and enable local coordinates so they are stuck to the worm and they don't fly around. Then I'll copy these properties and paste them into the tail particles and the head in the head shape. So now when the worm charges at the player, the particles look much better, as you can see. So to spawn the player portal and boss core when the final worm dies, I'll copy out the logic from the space worm died function and just leave the close wormhole boss defeated signals and the increase points and queue free. So now in the boss encounter, I'll add a worm defeated function which will pass the worm that died. So this will get the nodes in the space worm group, and if there is only one, it will increase the points by the final amount. And I'll move the final points from the worm to the encounter and set them through the editor. Then I will spawn the boss core at the worm.getNode head global position, and finally spawn the player portal at the same place. So this will now take a position for the spawn player portal, and here I'll just set the port 1 global position to the past parameter instead. So I'll get rid of the encounter defeated, and here emit the signal boss defeated instead, and then queue free to delete the entire encounter. Then in the spawn worm function, I'll connect to the worm boss defeated signal to the worm defeated function, and I'll bind the worm as the parameter. So now when you kill the final worm, it will spawn a portal to another dimension and drop the boss core, which can be used for talents at a later point. So that is working, and now if I go to the Olympus dimension, you can see the space worm still looks the same. So next time I will completely reskin the laser and the worms to match their boss flash colors that I set up. But that's all for now. Thank you for watching and have a great day.